ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात् ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. This is video number 6 on Bhagwan Sri Ramana Maharshi's clarification on self-enquiry. This video starts with three senses of self must be understood: Jiva, Atma and Paramatma. As the ego, which is the direct and immediate sense of I, is centered and figured in each of the distinct and separate individuals in a subtle moment of life force and mind stuff. It is termed Jiva here. This sense of I is separate in each individual being and preserving the distinctness of the individual behaves in a manner that would strengthen the individual's distinct character. But such a moment of the ego or the apparent self has its root and support in something that is the real basis of individuality and that does not move with or lose itself in the moment of the apparent self. Is something that is a continuous conscious principle related to the past, present and future, that is the real self signified. The Lakshyartha in the individual of which the ego is the apparent self. This latter is different in different individuals and is loosely called the Jivatma. But Atma, the self, is really one. The self of all individuals as of all existence is one. But Jivas or living beings are many as the individuals are formed. These are soul formations that are dissoluble in time, unlike their sporting self, which is eternal, being identical with the infinite eternal, which maintains its many-centered existence in an endless moment of formation and dissolution. Thus, we see that there are three distinct senses in which I is used. The supreme meaning of I, its Paramartha, is the Purusha who becomes the Lakshyartha, the signified sense in the individual, as it is the same self that presides over individual existence and the immediate or apparent sense of I. Vachyartha is the ego or the apparent self formed temporarily for purposes of individuation. Threefold then is the sense of the self, the I, and in its threefold sense it is to be understood. At some point, God steps in. You need not eliminate the wrong I. All that you need do is to find out its origin and abide there. Your effort can extend only thus far. Then the beyond will take care of itself. You are helpless there. No effort can reach it. By repeated practice, one can become accustomed to turning inwards and finding the self. One must always and constantly make an effort until one has permanently realized. Once the effort ceases, the state becomes natural and supreme takes possession of the person with an unbroken current until at until it has become permanently natural and your habitual state. Know that you have not realized the self, only glimpsed it. Liberation occurs at a stage of nirvikalpa samadhi called sahaja. Beyond Brahmajnana or Kaivalya Nirvikalpa Samadhi. The heart is the seat of Jnanam as well as of the Granthi, note of ignorance. It is represented in the physical body by a hole smaller than the smallest pinpoint, which is always shut. When the mind drops down in Kaivalya Nirvikalpa Samadhi, it opens but shuts again after it. When Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi is attained, it opens for good. He alone is liberated while alive, Jivan Mukta, whose wisdom is firm. The whole called the heart as small as a pinpoint is always shut, being the knot of ignorance which ties the body to consciousness. When the mind drops in the temporary Kevala Nirvikalpa, it opens but shuts again. In Sahaja, it remains always open. Sahaja is also Nirvikalpa. You are probably meaning Kevala Nirvikalpa, which is temporary, while the Samadhi lasts. The Sahaja Nirvikalpa is permanent and in it lies liberation from rebirth. As karma alone is responsible for the activity or inactivity of the sages, great souls have declared the state of Sahaja Nirvikalpa, the natural state without concepts alone, to be the ultimate state. Ramana Maharshi. Sahaja is the original state so that sadhana amounts to the removal of obstacles for the realization of this abiding truth. The I consciousness one is a prelude to self realization when it becomes permanent sahaja. 2. It is self realization, liberation. 1. That is Kevala Nirvikalpa Samadhi. 2. Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi. By repeated practice, one can become accustomed to turning inwards and finding the self. One must always and constantly make an effort until one has permanently realized. Once the effort ceases, the state becomes natural and the Supreme takes possession of the person with an unbroken current until it has become permanently natural and your habitual state. Know that you have not realized the self, only glimpsed it. Enquire into the nature of that consciousness which knows itself as I, and it will inevitably lead you to its source, the heart, where you will unmistakably perceive the distinction between the insentient body and the mind. The latter will then appear in its utter purity as the ever present, self supporting intelligence which creates, pervades its creation, as well as remains beyond it, unaffected and uncontaminated. Also, finding the heart will be experienced as being the heart. When this experience becomes permanent through constant practice, the much desired self realization or mukti is said at long last to have been achieved. The I am the body illusion has broken forever. Vasanas which do not obstruct self realization remain after self realization. In Yoga Vasishtha, two classes of vasanas are distinguished, those of enjoyment and those of bondage. Former remain even after mukti is attained, but the latter are destroyed by it. Attachment is the cause of binding vasanas, but enjoyment without attachment does not bind and continues even in sahaja. The state beyond bliss is the state of unceasing peace of mind, which is found in the state of absolute quiescence. Jagrat Susupti, sleep with awareness, which resembles inactive deep sleep. In this state, in spite of the activity of the body and the senses, there is no external awareness. Like a child immersed in sleep, who is not conscious of the food given to him by his mother. A yogi who is in this state is inactive even while engaged in activity. This is also called Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi, natural state of absorption in oneself without concepts. And this is the Nishtha, the settled state in the supreme reality, in the one substance, sport, and basis of the worshipper and the worshipped, in which is realized the identity of self with Brahma. In this verse, truth perception is described to be the highest poise of the self. In a subsequent verse, the 23rd, self perception or God realization is said to consist in the jiva or soul becoming food, that is, object of enjoyment or experience to the Lord. So we have two descriptions of the one exalted state, Sat Darshan and Atam Darshan, truth perception and self realization. Similarly, in the two invocatory verses commencing the work, this Supreme Brahma was described to be both impersonal and personal. Impersonal for purposes of Kaivalya Nishtha, the soul supreme poise, and personal for Sayujya, Sayujya, conscious union of the soul with Brahma. Thus, we are reminded that the two aspects are presented for the two distinct paths of knowledge and devotion that ultimately culminate in a supreme realization which, in view of the oneness of the being in the jiva as well as in the Isvara, is mentioned as Satdarshan Nishtha, and in the view of the jiva's relation in world existence to Isvara is named Atam Darshan Sayujya. On the question of attaining self realization, Bhagwan told me that in the early stages, a person who was regularly meditating would usually at first go into a trance which would probably last for some 30 minutes, and if he continued with his tapas properly, such samadhi would become more frequent. So, carried away by it would be that he would be able to think of nothing but slipping away to some quiet corner to meditate undisturbed. He would lose all interest in everything else until that time when he becomes established in the self and no more meditation was necessary. He had then attained Sahaja Samadhi or his natural state, but there were no fixed rules. Some might attain this state quietly and unrecognized without even the necessity of the process of meditation. In Nirvikalpa Samadhi, one has attained to a state where the identity has been lost and sunk entirely in the highest self. However long it may last, it is only temporary. One must return eventually to one's normal state of consciousness. One is unable to function in this state, and so long as it lasts, one is in a state of trance. It is usually preliminary to the final state. But Bhagwan attained Sahaja Samadhi directly without any intermediate state. Many people consider that Nirvikalpa Samadhi is final, and once having attained it, seek to progress no further. Sahaja Samadhi is the final and most blessed state, the goal of all yogis. In this state, the individual has become completely merged in the Supreme Self. His identity, which became lost in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, has become enlarged and is now the Supreme Self and knows itself as such. Trance is longer necessary. A person can still carry on with the ordinary day to day business, but he no identifies himself with the activities, but watches them like a dreamer watching a dream. There more to do and no more to be attained. This is the supreme state of absolute bliss. But in the words of Bhagwan, it is the self and it can be realized by one and all by self enquiry. If there are breaks in your self awareness, it means that you are not a jnani, enlightened sage yet. Before one becomes established in the self without any breaks, without any changes, one has to contact and enjoy the self many times. By steady meditation and the continued practice of self inquiry, one will finally become permanently established in the self without any breaks. Kaivalya Nirvikalpa Samadhi compared with Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi. In Kaivalya Nirvikalpa, there is the mental bucket still in existence under the water, which can be pulled out at any moment. Sahaja is like the river that has linked up with ocean from which there is no return. Nirvikalpa is chit, effortless, formless, consciousness. Where does the terror come that some people feel towards it? And where is the mystery in being oneself? To some people whose minds have become ripe from a long practice in the past, Nirvikalpa comes suddenly as a flood, but to others it comes in the course of their sadhana, which slowly wears down the obstructing thoughts and reveals the screen of pure awareness I. Further practice renders the screen permanently exposed. This is self realization, mukti, or sahja samadhi, the natural, effortless state. Nirvikalpas, the internal and the external. In the former, the mind completely merges in the inmost being and is all aware of nothing else. This is compared to a lamp protected from wind. But in the latter, although the mind is absorbed in the self, the sense of the world still prevails without a reaction from within and has the calm vastness of a waveless ocean. In both, the self is realized in its nakedness and the essence of bliss experienced when the waveless ocean of the external and the steady flame of the internal nirvikalpa are realized as identical. The ultimate goal, the Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi, is said to have been reached. Nirvikalpa is effortless, whereas Savikalpa is attained with effort. Abiding permanently in any of these samadhis, either Savikalpa or Nirvikalpa, is Sahaja. What is body consciousness? It is the insentient body plus consciousness. Both these must lie in another consciousness which is absolute and unaffected and ever abiding, with or without the body consciousness. What does it the matter whether the body consciousness is lost or retained, provided one is holding on to that pure consciousness? Total absence of body consciousness has the advantage of making the samadhi more intense, although it makes no difference in the knowledge of the Supreme. Holding on to the Supreme state is samadhi. When it is with effort due to mental disturbances, it is savikalpa. When these disturbances are absent, it is nirvikalpa. Remaining permanently in the primal state without effort is sahaja. Like nirvikalpa, there is an internal as well as an external savikalpa, depending on whether the disturbing thoughts are from outside or from inside. In Kevala Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the mind lies immersed in the light of the self, whereas the same mind lies in the darkness of ignorance in deep sleep, and the subject makes a distinction between samadhi and activity after waking up from samadhi. Moreover, activity of the body, of the sight, of the vital forces, and of the mind, and the cognizance of objects, all these are obstructions from one who seeks to realize Kevala Nirvikalpa Samadhi. In Sahaja Samadhi, however, the mind has resolved into the self and has been lost. The differences and obstructions mentioned above do not therefore exist here. The activities of such a being are like the feeding of a somnolent body, perceptible to the onlooker but not to the subject. The traveler sleeping in the moving cart is not aware of the motion of the cart because his mind is sunk in darkness, whereas the Sahaja Jnani remains unaware of his bodily activities because his mind is dead, having been resolved into the ecstasy of Chidananda, bliss of the self. The distinction between sleep, Kevala Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi can be clearly put in a tabular form as given by Sri Bhagwan. Sleep. Number one, mind alive. Kevala Nirvikalpa. Number one, mind alive. Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Number one, mind dead. Under sleep. Number 2 point, sunk in oblivion. Kevala sunk in light. Sahaja resolved into the self. 3. Kevala Nirvikalpa. Like a bucket tied to a rope and left lying in the water of the well. Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi. 3. Like a river discharged into the ocean and its identity lost. 4th, Kevala Nirvikalpa. 4th point, to be drawn out by the other end of the rope. Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi. 4th point, a river cannot be redirected from the ocean. The mind of the sage who has realized the self is wholly destroyed, it is dead, but to the onlooker he may seem to possess a mind just like the layman. Hence, the I in the sage has merely an apparent objective reality in fact. However, it has neither a subjective existence nor an objective reality. Number one, holding on to the reality is samadhi. Number two, holding on to reality with effort is savikalpa samadhi. Number three, merging in reality and remaining unaware of the world is nirvikalpa samadhi. Number four, merging in ignorance and remaining unaware of the world is sleep, head bends but not in samadhi. Fifth, remaining in the primal, pure natural state without effort is sahaja nirvikalpa samadhi. They can be further subdivided thus: swavikalpa samadhi, bahya external, antar internal. Bahya external, the mind jumps from one object to another. Antar, the mind is afflicted by kama, krodha, etc. Nirvikalpa swati. Bahya, that is external, merging in the one reality, underlying all the phenomenon. Antar, merging in the inmost being, which is the one reality giving rise to all thoughts, etc. It and this Bahya Savikalpa Samadhi, it it steady fixed on where from they steady fixed on the reality behind them. Antar, where from they arise and how they have their being hold on to their source. Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Bahya phenomena and remaining unaware of the transitory manifestations. Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Antar, giving rise to all thoughts, etc., and remaining unaware of anything. There are the external phenomena which are said to have their origin from the single reality, search for it and hold on to it. Antar Savikalpa. There are all manner of thoughts which rise up from the reality within and manifest themselves, hold on to that reality. Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Saja Nirvikalpa. Bhaiya. This state is compared to the waveless ocean whose waters are still and placid, internal. Nirvikalpa internal. This state is compared to a flame unagitated by currents of air but burning quite steady. All these four kinds of Savikalpa Samadhi are attended with effort. When these kinds of Nirvikalpa Samadhi are not attended with the effort and it is realized that the waveless ocean of external Samadhi and the steady flame of internal Samadhi are identical, the state is said to be Sahaja Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Self-inquiry versus other means of quieting the mind. In the afternoon, Khanna's wife appealed to Bhagwan in writing, I am not learned in the scriptures and I find the method of self-inquiry too hard for me. I am a woman with 7 children and a lot of household cares, and it leaves me little time for meditation. I request Bhagwan to give me some simpler and easier method. Bhagwan, no learning or knowledge of scripture is necessary to know the self, as no man requires a mirror to see himself. All knowledge is required only to be given up eventually as not self, nor is household work or cares with children necessary. Cares with children necessarily an obstacle. If you can do nothing more, at least continue saying I to yourself mentally and all the time as advised in Who Am I? Whatever work you may be doing, and whether you are sitting, standing, or walking, Bhagwan, there are only two ways to conquer destiny or be independent of it. One is to inquire for whom is this destiny and discover that only the ego is bound by destiny and not the self, and that the ego is non-existent. The other way is to kill the ego by completely surrendering it to the Lord, by realizing one's helplessness and saying all the time, not I but thou, O Lord, and giving up all sense of I and mine and leaving it to the Lord to do what He likes with you. Surrender can never be regarded as complete so long as the devotee wants this or that from the Lord. True surrender is love of God for the sake of love and nothing else, not even for the sake of salvation. In other words, complete effacement of the ego is necessary to conquer destiny, whether you achieve this effacement through self inquiry or through bhakti marga. Meditation is possible only if the ego is retained. There is the ego and the object meditated upon. This method is indirect. However, if we seek the ego source, the ego disappears and what remains is the self. This method is the direct one. Other than inquiry, there are no adequate means. If through other means it is sought to control the mind will appear to be controlled but will again go forth. Through the control of breath also the mind will become quiescent, but it will be quiescent only so long as the breath remains controlled, and when the breath resumes, the mind also will again start moving and will wander as impelled by residual impressions. The source is the same for both mind and breath. Thought indeed is the nature of the mind. The thought I is the first thought of the mind, and that is egoity. It is from that whence egoity originates, that breath also originates therefore. When the mind becomes quiescent, the breath is controlled, and when the breath is controlled, the mind becomes quiescent. Breath is the gross form of mind till the time of death. The mind keeps breath in the body, and when the body dies, the mind takes the breath along with it. Therefore, the exercise of breath control is only an aid for rendering the mind quiescent. Mano nigraha. It will not destroy the mind. Mano nasha. All disciplines such as sacrifice, charity, austerity, observance of vows, japa, yoga, and puja are in effect modes of meditation of the form I am Brahma. So, in all the modes of disciplines, one should see to it that one does not stray away from the thought I am Brahma. This is the purport of this worship of the attributeless. Like the practice of breath control, meditation on the forms of God, repetition of mantras, restriction on food, etc., but aids for rendering the mind quiescent. Through meditation on the forms of God and through repetition of mantras, the mind becomes one pointed. The mind will always be wandering, just as when a chain is given to an elephant to hold in its trunk, it will go along grasping the chain and nothing else. So also when the mind is occupied with a name or form, it will grasp that alone. When the mind expands in the form of countless thoughts, each thought becomes weak, but thoughts get resolved. The mind becomes one pointed and strong. For such a mind, self inquiry will become easy. To make the rebellious mind calm and tranquil, either see its source so that it may disappear, or surrender yourself to that it may be struck down. Self surrender is the same as self knowledge, and either of them necessarily implies self control. The ego submits only when it recognizes the higher power. There is no mind to control. If the self is realized, the self shines forth when the mind vanishes. In the realized man, the mind may be active or inactive. The self alone exists, for the mind, body, and world are not separate from the self. Can they be other than the self? When aware of the self, why should one worry about these shadows? How do they affect the self? If the enquiry is made whether mind exists, it will be found that mind does not exist. That is control of mind. Otherwise, if the mind is taken to exist and one seeks to control it, it amounts to mind controlling the mind, just like a thief turning out to be a policeman to catch the thief. That is himself. Mind persists in that way alone but eludes itself. Breath control is the means for mind control. Breath can be controlled either by absolute retention of breath, Kevala, Kumbhaka, or by regulation of breath, Pranayama. Hatha Yoga is one of the aids to liberation. Note that it is always necessary, it depends upon the person. Vichara surpasses Pranayama. In Yoga Vasishta, Chodala advises investigation, Vichara to Shekhi for killing the ego. Reality can be reached by holding on to prana or intellect. Hatha Yoga is the former, Vichara is the latter. There is No doubt that breath control is the means for mind control, because the mind, like breath, is a part of air, because the nature of mobility is common to both, because the place of origin is the same for both, and because when one of them is controlled, the other gets controlled. Ramana. Absolute retention of breath, Kevala Kumbhaka, is making the vital air stay firmly in the heart even without exhalation and inhalation. This is achieved through meditation on the vital principle, etc. A regulation of breath is making the vital air stay firmly in the heart through exhalation, inhalation, and retention, according to the instructions given in the yoga text. So I complete this video here, and next video will start with question answer. Thank you for watching this video. Please like, comment and share the video. Subscribe the channel. Thanks a lot. Namaskar, my dear friend.